Hey everyone, go ahead and dim the lights, fluff the pillow, and get cozy. Maybe grab some water, or, that half-empty tea mug you keep on the nightstand and pretend is fresh. Because tonight, we're drifting back to one of those nights that American history can't stop talking about. It's April 14th, 1865. Washington, D.C. smells like spring, mud, and whatever passes for street hygiene in the 19th century. The Civil War has just ended, finally, and the whole country is wobbling between joy, grief, and that weird silence that comes after a 4-year national breakdown. And in the middle of all this, Abraham Lincoln, the tall, melancholy president who looked like a man halfway between philosopher and ghost. Let's start the evening slow, because it really was slow. Lincoln had one of those days that felt too calm to be real. He woke up early, like he always did. He wasn't exactly the sleep-in type. Years of war tend to ruin your REM cycles. He spent the morning in meetings, shuffling papers, and talking to people about Reconstruction, which was basically code for what do we do now that half the country hates the other half and everyone's broke. He was in a strangely good mood. Mary, his wife, even said later that he'd never seemed happier, which, is the kind of statement that only sounds sweet until you remember she said it after he died. Then it feels like history's version of, he was glowing before the accident. Abraham Lincoln had breakfast with his son Robert, who'd just come back from serving in the war. For once, the conversation wasn't about military reports or casualties. It was about plans, normal family stuff, the kind of talk that people only have when they think they have time. Throughout the morning, he met with his cabinet. They talked about leniency, reconciliation, all those hopeful things you want your leader to say after a war. He even mentioned wanting to visit Europe or maybe the Holy Land. A rare moment where Lincoln allowed himself to imagine being a person instead of a president. By the afternoon, he was riding through Washington with Mary. They took a carriage ride, something they hadn't done in forever. And during that ride, he told her, "We must both be more cheerful in the future," which is such a gentle, almost naive thing to say for a man whose entire presidency had been a 4-year tragedy in real time. Mary apparently said she hadn't seen him so relaxed in years. And honestly, that's probably true. He'd been carrying the weight of 600,000 deaths, a divided country, and a collapsing economy. But that night, he just wanted to go to the theater. Because sometimes, even presidents need a night out. Let's drift over to Ford's Theater. It's not glamorous. It's a converted Baptist church, which feels like the perfect metaphor for America in 1865. Half sacred, half chaotic. The play that night was called Our American Cousin, a British comedy about awkward Americans visiting English relatives, which, for reasons lost to time, was apparently hilarious to people in the 19th century. The Lincolns were invited by Henry Rathbone, a young officer, and his fiancée Clara Harris. The Lincolns had asked several other people to come, but everyone else bailed. General Grant said no, and others had plans, which, to be fair, probably saved their lives. So the group of 4 settled into the presidential box. The fancy one, draped in flags, because of course it was. It was the kind of spot you couldn't miss, even if you weren't looking for it. Now here's where we quietly float over to the man who'd been looking for it. John Wilkes Booth. Actor, Confederate sympathizer, and, in his own mind, a tragic hero in a one-man play that no one else had signed up for. Booth was famous in his time, a real theater celebrity, handsome, dramatic, and extremely full of himself. The kind of guy who would absolutely describe himself as misunderstood. He'd been planning something for weeks. Originally, he wanted to kidnap Lincoln, because that always works out well. But after the South surrendered, his plan shifted. Now it wasn't about ransom, it was about revenge. And in a move that can only be described as historically bad timing, Lincoln's relaxed night at the theater lined up perfectly with Booth's decision to finally act. Meanwhile, back inside Ford's theater, the play was rolling along. The audience laughed, the orchestra hummed. Lincoln sat in his rocking chair, holding Mary's hand, smiling faintly at the actors. It was the first time in months anyone had seen him at peace. And then, in one of those quiet in-between moments of the play, Booth slipped into the theater. He knew it well. He'd performed there before. He waited until the exact line that always got the biggest laugh. Then he opened the door to the presidential box, stepped inside, and fired his small .44 caliber pistol. The shot echoed, but for a few seconds, no one really understood what had happened. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. One moment, laughter. The next, chaos. Lincoln slumped forward, still in his chair, blood on his collar. Mary screamed. Rathbone turned to stop Booth, but got stabbed for his effort. Booth vaulted over the railing, breaking his leg when he landed, and shouted something that was supposed to sound heroic, but mostly came off like 19th century bad theater. Sic semper tyrannis. And then he limped out the back door into the dark. Let's pause there for a moment, because all this sounds dramatic, and it is. But it's also strangely quiet when you imagine it. Ford's theater didn't have bright lights or modern sound. There was confusion, not panic. A few people thought the noise was part of the show. Others stood frozen. And Lincoln? He never moved again. Doctors rushed in. One of them, a young army surgeon named Charles Lale, reached the president first. He did what he could, but it was clear almost immediately. Lincoln was not going to recover. The bullet had entered behind his left eye, lodged behind his right eye. There wasn't much anyone could do in 1865 for a wound like that. They carried him out the side door, across the street, to a small boarding house owned by a tailor named William Peterson. Imagine that for a second. The most powerful man in America, bleeding and unconscious, being carried through the muddy streets of D.C. and into a stranger's rented room. They laid him diagonally across a bed. He was too tall to fit otherwise, and called for doctors, cabinet members, soldiers, anyone who could be of use. Mary was hysterical. Robert Lincoln was called in. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, arrived and took charge of the room like it was a command post. Outside, a crowd started forming. Word was spreading fast. The president's been shot. Inside, that cramped bedroom, the night dragged on. Lincoln never gained consciousness. His breathing was slow, shallow. Sometimes he'd stir, but not wake. The doctors tried everything they knew: bleeding, brandy, hot compresses, even removing a blood clot, but nothing worked. It was quiet, except for the sound of people crying, whispering, and the occasional hiss of a candle being replaced. Mary would go in and out of the room, unable to stay or leave. At one point she fainted. Someone later described her as utterly broken, which might be the understatement of the century. Around 7:22 the next morning, April 15, 1865, Lincoln took his last breath, and Stanton, ever the man of somber authority, said the line everyone remembers: "Now he belongs to the ages." Or maybe he said angels. The room was quiet. People heard it differently. Either way, that's how it ended. Booth, meanwhile, was on the run. He thought he'd done something grand, something that would make him a hero in the South. Instead, he became America's most wanted fugitive. His escape was a mess of broken legs, hiding in swamps, and failed plans. 12 days later, soldiers cornered him in a Virginia barn. He refused to surrender. The barn was set on fire, and he was shot. Whether by his own hand or someone else's is still argued about. Either way, his story ended in smoke and irony. Back in Washington, Lincoln's body was taken to the White House, then to the Capitol, and finally on a slow funeral train through 7 states.
Millions lined the tracks to see it pass. He'd gone from the most mocked, hated president in American history to a national martyr in less than a week. Because apparently, that's how politics works. And Mary, poor Mary, was left to wander through years of grief, debt, and paranoia. She lost 3 of her 4 sons and the husband who'd been her whole life. People called her unstable, which wasn't entirely wrong, but also understandable. The thing about Lincoln's last night is that it wasn't filled with drama or foreshadowing. It was just calm, ordinary, the kind of day that doesn't feel like the end of anything. He talked about travel, laughed at a comedy, held his wife's hand. It was a peaceful evening, until it wasn't. And that's what makes it quietly haunting. Not the gunshot, not the famous last words, but the stillness before it all happened. The calm after 4 years of chaos. As the sun rose over Washington that next morning, the bells started tolling. The city that had celebrated the end of war just days before now mourned the man who'd seen it through. And in that small rented room across from the theater, the bed where Lincoln died would never be used again. People would come from everywhere just to stand there, look at it, and whisper. History loves its ironies. Lincoln had led the country through its darkest hour, and when it was finally over, when he could finally rest, he never woke up again. That's the thing about nights like this in history. They don't feel like history when they're happening. They feel small, human, quiet. Just a man leaving for the theater. Just a woman fixing her hair in the mirror. Just a couple holding hands during a play. Until suddenly it becomes the moment the world can't stop retelling. And that's where we'll leave the first part tonight. You can close your eyes now. The streets of Washington are empty. The candles are burning low. The war is over. And Lincoln, finally, is at peace.
Hey there, still awake? Or maybe just half listening with one ear pressed into the pillow. That's fine. Tonight's story drifts on quietly from where we left off. Lincoln's last breath and the quiet chaos that followed. The morning of April 15th, 1865, Washington, D.C. woke up to confusion. Bells were ringing, people were crying in the streets, and rumors multiplied faster than facts. The president was dead. The assassin had escaped, and the capital city, which already looked like an exhausted camp after years of war, felt hollowed out. But history never likes to pause. It just stumbles forward. Let's float back to John Wilkes Booth. He was out there somewhere in the dark countryside, limping badly, his leg broken from that overly dramatic leap off the theater balcony. He'd ridden out of Washington on horseback with a friend, David Harold, who was basically the nervous sidekick in this whole disaster. Booth liked to think of himself as a man in a grand tragedy. He scribbled in his diary, called himself a hero and complained that no one seemed to appreciate his sacrifice, which, to be fair, is a classic problem for men who commit murder and then expect applause. He imagined the South would rise again, that people would cheer his name. Instead, the Confederacy had already collapsed. Richmond was burned. Robert E. Lee had surrendered. Booth was hiding in the woods with a broken leg and bad news catching up to him. They stopped first at the house of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Yes, that Dr. Mudd, a country physician who set Booth's leg and, intentionally or not, became part of the story. Dr. Mudd didn't ask too many questions, which was probably a mistake. By the time he realized who he'd treated, the entire federal government was hunting for the assassin. Mudd was later arrested for helping him, though he always claimed ignorance. Booth, meanwhile, kept hobbling south, swamps, barns, dirt roads. For a man who'd once lived for applause, he was now surrounded by mosquitoes and silence. He'd become the most wanted man in America. Posters with his face went up everywhere. Rewards were offered, $100,000 total, a massive sum for the time. The army and detectives fanned out, searching farms, crossing rivers, interrogating anyone who'd ever met him. The city that had celebrated victory just a week ago now moved under a shadow. Back in Washington, Lincoln's body lay in the White House's East Room, surrounded by flowers and silence. Thousands came to see him. The man who'd been mocked in newspapers for years was now being called Father Abraham. The country was grieving, but it was also suspicious. People wanted someone to blame, not just Booth, but anyone who'd helped him. And there were plenty. Booth hadn't acted entirely alone. He'd been part of a small, confused group of conspirators who thought they could save the South by taking out the top of the Union government. There was Lewis Powell, a tall, quiet man who'd tried to murder Secretary of State William Seward that same night. He stormed into his home, slashed at him with a knife, and left the secretary bloodied but alive. There was George Atzerodt, whose assignment was to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but who lost his nerve and spent the night drinking instead. Classic procrastination. And then there was Mary Surratt, a widowed boarding house owner whose place had become a meeting spot for Booth's crew. She claimed she didn't know what they were planning. The government wasn't buying it. By April 20th, the net was tightening. The war was over, but Washington looked like a city under siege again. Soldiers everywhere, military tribunals forming, and the eerie sense that the country itself was on trial. Booth and Harold made it as far as Virginia. They hid in a tobacco barn owned by a farmer named Richard Garrett. They were exhausted, dirty, and surrounded. The Union soldiers finally caught up to them on April 26th. The troops called out for surrender. Harold gave up immediately. Booth didn't. He refused to come out, declaring that he'd rather die than be captured, which at this point was the first brave thing he'd actually done. The soldiers set the barn on fire. Smoke filled the air, and as Booth staggered inside, someone fired a shot. A soldier named Boston Corbett. Booth collapsed, shot through the neck. His last words were supposedly, "Tell my mother I die for my country." But history suspects he just mumbled something less poetic. Either way, he was dead within hours. The manhunt was over. Booth's body was brought back to Washington under heavy guard. Soldiers and officials came to see him, the face that had once drawn crowds in theaters, now pale and still. He was buried secretly, in an unmarked grave in the old penitentiary at the Washington Arsenal. For years, his family didn't even know where. It was all very hush-hush, as if the government wanted him to vanish from memory entirely. Spoiler, it didn't work. While Booth's story ended in a burning barn, the real reckoning was just beginning for the others. The conspirators' trial was held in May 1865. It wasn't a normal court. This was a military tribunal, which meant fast decisions and harsh sentences. 8 people stood accused: Powell, Harold, Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, and a few others who'd helped in smaller ways. The courtroom was hot, crowded, and miserable. Reporters filled the benches. The public wanted blood. Mary Surratt, the boarding house owner, insisted she was innocent, but her connection to Booth and her calm, composed demeanor made her a perfect villain in the public's eyes. After weeks of testimony, all 8 were found guilty. 4 were sentenced to hang: Powell, Harold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt. Her execution was especially controversial. She became the first woman the U.S. government ever executed. President Andrew Johnson refused to commute her sentence despite pleas from her lawyers and her daughter. On July 7, 1865, the 4 prisoners were led to the gallows in the courtyard of the Washington Arsenal. It was a hot day. The crowd was silent. Surratt wore a black dress and veil. When asked if she had any last words, she simply said, "Don't let me fall." And then the trapdoor opened. If you've ever seen the old photos of that execution, the grainy black and white ones, they look strangely dreamlike. 4 figures, hooded, standing on wooden planks under a bright sky. Soldiers lined up, hats off. It feels distant, but uncomfortably real, like watching history and humanity blurred together for a moment. The bodies hung for about 25 minutes. Then they were cut down and buried nearby. Later, their remains were quietly moved, lost, found again. History loves to rearrange its evidence. After that, Washington tried to move on. The war was over, the assassins were dead or imprisoned, and the country turned toward rebuilding. But grief doesn't move on so easily, especially not for Mary Lincoln. She was 46, and she had already buried 3 of her sons. Now she had to watch the world turn her husband into a legend, a marble statue, while she was left behind as a footnote. Mary was always described as emotional, which in 19th century terms meant a woman with opinions. She was high-strung, passionate, and deeply attached to her husband. After his death, she was never the same. She wore black for the rest of her life. She traveled aimlessly through Europe, often broke, often sick, and constantly followed by gossip. At one point, her surviving son, Robert, had her committed to an asylum for her own safety, he claimed. She eventually got out, but never forgave him. Her letters from that time are haunting, full of grief, confusion, and a desperate search for meaning. She once wrote, "My grief knows no healing. My heart will never rest." And honestly, she was right. Lincoln's death didn't just end a presidency. It ended an era. Andrew Johnson took over, and let's just say he wasn't exactly up to.
Hey again. If you're still awake, that's impressive. If you're not, that's okay. This isn't exactly meant to compete with caffeine. Tonight, we float onward, past the tragedy, past the gallows, past the smoke of that April morning. and to what came next, the long, slow, strangely peaceful process of turning Abraham Lincoln from a man into something else entirely. A myth, a symbol, a bedtime story for a country that needed to believe in one. The thing about death is that it gives everyone something to do. In 1865, the United States was emotionally wrecked. The Civil War had ended literally 5 days before the assassination. The parades were still echoing when the bells started tolling for Lincoln. The whole country seemed to move in slow motion. Businesses closed, church bells rang for hours, people wore black armbands and stopped talking mid-sentence, like sound itself had become inappropriate. It wasn't just grief, it was shock, the kind that sinks in so deep it turns into ritual. And so began the longest funeral procession in American history. Lincoln's body left Washington on April 21st in a special funeral train that would take him home to Springfield, Illinois. The route covered more than 1,600 miles. The train moved at about 20 miles an hour, slow enough for crowds to gather at every crossing, every small town station, every field where people could see the black-draped cars passing. Cities along the route held ceremonies, built arches, and printed pamphlets. In Philadelphia, more than 150,000 people lined up to see the coffin. In New York, the lines stretched for miles. It was as if the whole country had decided that walking slowly behind a casket was the only way to feel alive again. The train passed through Baltimore, the same city where Lincoln had secretly snuck through years earlier to avoid an assassination plot. Irony, as usual, had perfect timing. At every stop, church choirs sang, soldiers stood guard, and people wept over the open coffin. It's said that some even touched his hands just to be sure he was really gone. And by the time the train reached Springfield, Lincoln wasn't just a president anymore. He was a saint. The language people used changed almost overnight. Newspapers that had spent years mocking him for being awkward, ugly, or too soft suddenly called him the savior of the Union. Ministers compared him to Moses. Children were taught to speak his name in Sunday school. The transformation was immediate, emotional, and maybe a little too convenient. Because America wasn't just mourning Lincoln, it was trying to forgive itself. The war had been brutal, and the peace that followed was bitter. North and South were both exhausted. Everyone wanted to believe the suffering had meant something. And Lincoln, quiet, humble, tragic Lincoln, made the perfect vessel for that hope. He didn't have the arrogance of a conqueror. He didn't die in victory parades or on battlefields. He died sitting in a theater, holding his wife's hand. Which is to say, he died like a person. And that's exactly what the country needed, a symbol of human decency to balance out 4 years of human cruelty. The mythology started small. Painters created dreamy portraits of Lincoln with angels hovering nearby. Poets compared him to Christ, the martyr president. And spiritualists, who were basically the influencers of the 1860s, claimed to be in touch with his spirit. Yes, seances were very in at the time. The Lincolns themselves had hosted a few in the White House while Willie, their son, was alive. After his death, Mary Lincoln went all in. She visited mediums, took part in seances, and claimed to have spoken with both her husband and her sons from beyond the veil. Spiritualism was the 19th century version of therapy, plus candles. It was comforting to imagine that Lincoln wasn't entirely gone, that maybe he was still hovering above the broken country, nodding gently, maybe still telling people to be more cheerful. But not everyone was peaceful about it.
For years, rumors and conspiracies floated through the newspapers that Booth hadn't really died, that there was a deeper plot, that maybe foreign governments had a hand in it. Some people said the whole assassination was divine punishment. Others said it was part of a cosmic plan. But mostly people just needed the story to mean something. Because meaningless tragedy is unbearable. So, the story got rewritten, polished, repainted. Lincoln became not just the president who freed the slaves, but the moral center of America, the calm voice in the storm, the one who'd been too good for the world that killed him. And the country, freshly traumatized, really leaned into that idea. Let's drift a little forward. It's now the late 1860s. The Civil War monuments are going up. Reconstruction is already falling apart. But in Springfield, a massive tomb is being built, Lincoln's final resting place. It's part monument, part temple, complete with statues, arches, and a towering obelisk that looks like something ancient and mournful. Visitors came by the thousands, leaving flowers, notes, and occasionally, odd offerings. Someone once left a lock of hair, someone else a Bible. There was even a report of a visitor who tried to kiss the glass over his coffin, which, in fairness, is one way to honor someone. But the strangest thing was what happened to his body. In 1876, 11 years after his death, a group of counterfeiters in Chicago decided to steal Lincoln's corpse. Yes, really. Their plan was to break into the tomb, grab the body, and hold it for ransom to get one of their fellow forgers out of prison. Because nothing says smart plan like kidnapping a president's remains. They managed to break into the tomb, but the coffin was heavier than expected, and one of them got drunk halfway through. The Secret Service, which at the time was ironically created to fight counterfeiting, caught them in the act. After that, officials quietly decided to make sure that never happened again. So, in 1901, Lincoln's coffin was opened one last time in front of witnesses, including his son Robert, to confirm that the body was really there. They saw his face, still recognizable, almost peaceful. Then the coffin was buried in a steel cage and covered in concrete. Now he really wasn't going anywhere. The myth, though, had already escaped. By the early 1900s, Lincoln was less of a man and more of a national bedtime story. The log cabin boy who rose to greatness, the humble genius, the honest lawyer, the gentle emancipator. And most of that was true, but not all. He was complicated, depressed, often lonely, sometimes indecisive. But myths don't like complexity. Myths prefer marble. So the real, weary human being slowly vanished beneath all the monuments and textbooks and moral lessons. It's the same thing history does to everyone eventually. It polishes the wrinkles out of reality. By the 1920s, Lincoln's face was everywhere. Stamps, coins, schools, highways, entire towns named after him. The Lincoln Memorial opened in 1922, that enormous seated statue, calm and distant, as if he's still waiting for the nation to calm down enough to talk to him again. The dedication ceremony was full of speeches about unity, justice, and healing. And then, in true American irony, the event was racially segregated. Even in death, Lincoln couldn't get the country to practice what he preached. Meanwhile, Mary Lincoln's ghost story kept unfolding quietly. After her death in 1882, her letters were sealed away for years. When historians finally read them, They found the raw heartbreak of someone who'd been written off as hysterical when she was simply grieving. She was buried beside her husband and sons in Springfield, and sometimes visitors claim they feel something in that tomb, a draft, a shiver, a sense of being watched. Maybe it's just the architecture, or maybe some stories never entirely settle down. The country, of course, kept moving. Wars, depressions, new presidents.
Each generation found its own version of Lincoln, the progressive reformer, the quiet conservative, the symbol of freedom, the patron saint of whatever America wants to believe about itself today. He became flexible, mythologically speaking, a mirror more than a man. But somewhere in all that reverence, there's still the quiet truth. He wasn't a saint. He was tired. He was funny, awkward, brilliant, and deeply sad. He loved bad jokes, theater, and long carriage rides. He lost more in his life than most people can imagine, and somehow kept going. That's the real story, the one that makes the marble statue seem almost too still. If you go to Ford's Theater today, you can still see his chair, the same rocking chair he sat in that night. It's cushioned, faded, worn, the kind of thing that shouldn't be behind glass but is. Across the street, at the Peterson house, the bed is still there. The clock on the mantel still shows 7:22, the moment he died. It's all preserved, like time itself just stopped. And maybe that's the point, because Lincoln's story isn't about motion anymore. It's about pause, reflection, the long exhale after chaos. He came to symbolize what Americans want to believe about endurance, that you can hold on even when everything is breaking and still speak softly when you do it. Sometimes history doesn't need excitement. Sometimes it just needs quiet. A man in a rocking chair watching a play, a train moving slowly through the night, a statue staring into eternity, calm and unblinking. The kind of moments that seem small until they become the ones that never stop echoing. So, as the lights dim one last time tonight, let's leave Lincoln where he finally belongs, not in marble, not in myth, but in memory. A weary man who did his best, held the country together with trembling hands, and managed somehow to keep a little bit of kindness in the middle of the storm. He didn't live to see peace, but he gave it a name. You can rest now. The train has reached Springfield. The flags are folded. The crowd has gone home. And the tall, tired man who never really got a good night's sleep finally does.
Hey, welcome back. Still awake. That's impressive. Or maybe you're half asleep and just floating along, which honestly is the goal here. Either way, let's keep drifting. We followed Lincoln through his heavy last day, the long carriage rides, the gentle smiles, the weariness behind them. But the night isn't over yet, because now we're heading toward that fateful theater where laughter and tragedy somehow found themselves sitting side by side. It's April 14th, 1865. Washington is humid and restless. The Civil War is done, or at least mostly done. Soldiers are still out there mopping up the last scraps of Confederate resistance, but the fighting that once shook the nation is over. People are drinking, singing, shooting fireworks, and pretending the last 4 years never happened. The city smells like cheap ale and burnt gunpowder, the smell of victory if you're feeling optimistic. But inside the White House, Lincoln is simply tired, and that's an understatement. He's not a man built for celebration. He's built for worry. He's built for pacing floors at 3 a.m., clutching telegrams, wondering if someone will die because he didn't sign something fast enough. That morning, he told his cabinet, half cheerfully, half cryptically, that he'd had a strange dream again. A ship sailing toward an endless shore. He'd had it before, usually before major battles. It wasn't exactly comforting, but Lincoln had always been drawn to symbolism. He probably didn't realize that this one was basically foreshadowing his own exit. Now, let's float forward to that evening. The plan was to relax, or as relaxed as you can be when the whole country's watching you breathe. Mary Todd had picked the play, Our American Cousin, a comedy, supposedly. Lincoln wasn't much of a theater guy, but he went along with it. He even invited General Grant and his wife, because nothing says post-war date night like sitting next to your commanding officer. The Grants politely declined, saying they had to travel. Historians like to note that this was probably the best canceled plan in U.S. history. Instead, the Lincolns were joined by a young Army officer, Major Henry Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Rathbone was one of those clean-cut Civil War heroes, polite, nervous, probably very good at sitting still in uniforms. Clara was the daughter of a New York senator. Together, they made a perfect chaperone double date. Now, over at Ford's Theater, the atmosphere was the opposite of presidential. It was noisy, crowded, and buzzing. The theater itself wasn't huge, maybe 1,000 seats if everyone squished in. The walls were painted in that particular shade of gold that always looks slightly sweaty under lamplight. The play was British, set in England, and full of those mid-19th century jokes that only made sense if you thought people falling off chairs was peak comedy. The presidential box had been decorated with flags, one of them, ironically, the very same kind of flag that would later tangle John Wilkes Booth's leg. Booth himself had been around the theater all afternoon making sure his escape routes were ready, which was maybe not something you want an actor doing. Because yes, Booth wasn't some random drifter. He was famous, like genuinely famous. Handsome, charming, the kind of actor who'd probably have 1 million followers today just for brooding on camera. He came from a family of actors. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, had been a Shakespearean legend and a walking disaster of a man. Booth the younger had a chip on his shoulder the size of Virginia. He was a Confederate sympathizer, convinced that killing Lincoln would somehow save the South. Spoiler, it wouldn't. That night, Booth knew exactly what he was doing. He waited until around 10:15 p.m., when the play reached its funniest moment, a bit of slapstick that guaranteed laughter loud enough to cover a gunshot. He had slipped into the theater earlier, showing off his actor's pass to the staff, who barely blinked. After all, this was John Wilkes Booth. What harm could he do? Back in the box, Lincoln was reportedly in good spirits. He'd laughed at the play, even if he didn't totally get it. He leaned slightly forward on the railing, one arm around Mary. They were close again that night. The war had put distance between them, but something about peace had softened him. Then, at that exact moment, the famous line, "You sucked a logic and old man trap," Booth slipped in. The door behind the presidential box was unguarded except for a single servant who Booth distracted. He wedged a wooden stick between the door and the frame, effectively locking it from the inside. Smooth, calculated, terrifyingly calm. He crept up behind Lincoln, pulled out a small .44 caliber Derringer pistol, and fired a single bullet into the back of the president's head. And just like that, the world tilted. The sound was muffled, swallowed by laughter. For a few seconds, no one in the audience even realized what had happened. Mary Todd screamed. Rathbone jumped up, turned, and lunged at Booth. Booth slashed him with a dagger, slicing open his arm nearly to the bone. Then, like the melodramatic stage performer he was, Booth vaulted over the railing of the box. His spur caught in the bunting, snapping his leg when he landed. he still managed to stand, raise the knife, and shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for, "thus always to tyrants." Because nothing says subtle political statement like quoting the guy who killed Caesar. He hobbled across the stage, yelling something else, maybe "the South is avenged," and disappeared into the chaos backstage. Meanwhile, in the box, everything dissolved in panic. Mary Todd was hysterical. Clara Harris was covered in blood, some of it her fiancé's, some of it Lincoln's. Rathbone tried to open the door, but the wooden bar held fast. When someone finally smashed it open, the crowd below had realized what happened, and the theater had turned into a storm of confusion. People screamed, soldiers rushed the stage. A doctor named Charles Leal, just 23 years old, pushed his way through the crowd. He found Lincoln slumped in his chair, head tilted forward, his pulse barely there. Leal cleared the blood from the wound, not that it would help much, and declared calmly, "He is alive, but his wound is mortal." From there, Lincoln was carried, slowly, carefully, out of the theater and across the street to the Peterson House, a small boarding house where he would spend his final hours. Let's pause for a second and just breathe, because the image of that moment, the laughter, the scream, the fall, it's both too vivid and strangely distant, almost cinematic. But remember, everyone there was human, tired, confused, scared. No one knew yet that they were living through one of the most replayed moments in American history. And Lincoln, he wasn't gone yet. In the room across the street, he would linger for 9 long hours, breathing shallowly, never waking, while the people around him whispered and wept. We'll drift there next, because history, as always, refuses to end neatly.
Hey there, welcome back. Still with me? That's dedication. Or maybe you've just sunk fully into that cozy half-sleep zone where everything sounds like it's narrated underwater. Perfect. Because this part of the story, it isn't loud. It's quiet, hauntingly quiet. We're now across the street from Ford's Theater, in a narrow red brick townhouse called the Peterson House. You can still visit it today, though honestly, it feels more like a whisper than a museum. The air's heavy there, not because of ghosts or drama, but because of stillness. This was where Abraham Lincoln stopped being a living man and started being history. It's just after 10:30 p.m. The street outside is chaos. Carriages rumbling, people screaming, soldiers shouting orders that make no sense. But inside, it's different. The room they carried Lincoln into was small, just about 9 feet wide. Too small for a dying president, really. The soldiers didn't even try to bring him back to the White House. It was too far, too bumpy, and frankly too undignified to drag a bleeding, unconscious man through the muddy streets of D.C. So they just took him to the nearest bed that would fit him. And that happened to be a cheap boarding house room owned by a tailor named William Peterson. Picture it, a simple room, wallpapered with small floral patterns, a wooden bed, angled diagonally because Lincoln was too tall to fit straight across. The sheets were white, or maybe off-white. It's hard to tell in lamplight. They laid him down gently. His clothes were soaked through with blood, his hair matted. Someone cut the collar open. Someone else whispered prayers. And then, time slowed to a crawl. Dr. Charles Leal, remember him? The young army doctor who'd first rushed to Lincoln's side, took charge. He was joined by 2 other physicians, Dr. Taft and Dr. King, who also happened to be in the audience that night. Imagine that. 3 doctors, all just there for a comedy, now crouched over a dying president. They examined him by candlelight. No modern medicine, no antiseptic, no anesthesia. They probed the wound with their fingers, which, yes, is as grim as it sounds, and found the bullet had lodged deep behind the right eye. They knew there was nothing to be done. Surgery would kill him instantly. Moving him would kill him, so they didn't try. Instead, They did what people do when science runs out. They kept him comfortable. They propped him up slightly to help him breathe. They wiped his face. They kept his pulse. They waited. By midnight, word had spread. The president was dying. Not dead, dying. And that difference mattered to everyone. People poured into the street outside, forming a silent crowd. Some prayed, some just stared. Others probably didn't even believe it was real, because how could it be? Just that morning, he'd been smiling, talking about peace, holding his wife's hand in a carriage. And now, this. Inside, the room was filling up too. Cabinet members arrived one by one. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton came in like a storm cloud, immediately taking command. He ordered soldiers to guard the doors, banned reporters from the room, and began writing telegrams between pauses to check Lincoln's pulse himself. Stanton was the kind of man who could turn grief into paperwork. A skill, really. Mary Todd Lincoln was there for a while, weeping uncontrollably, sometimes collapsing into hysterics. Her cries echoed down the narrow hallway. At one point, Stanton had her gently escorted out so the doctors could work. It sounds cruel, but there was nothing left to work on. She had already lost 3 of her 4 sons to illness. Now she was losing her husband too, and she knew it. Outside the bedroom, in the parlor, people gathered in clusters. Senators, generals, and aides whispered to each other like they were in church. No one dared to speak above a murmur. The gas lamps flickered. The night dragged on. From time to time, Lincoln's breathing grew shallow, those long, labored gasps that make everyone lean in just to check if that was the last one. But somehow, it never was. His heart, that steady, stubborn thing that had carried him through so much, just kept going. Someone, maybe Dr. Leal, remarked that Lincoln seemed peaceful. He said his features are calm and natural. And that's the strange, almost cruel beauty of it. Lincoln looked serene. He hadn't stirred since the shot. He hadn't spoken a word. It was as if he just drifted somewhere far away, unreachable, but calm. Around 2 a.m., Robert Lincoln, the president's oldest son, arrived. He'd been summoned from a nearby house. He entered quietly, kissed his father's forehead, and sat at his side. It's one of those historical details that always lingers. The son sitting vigil for the father who had saved the nation but couldn't save himself. Meanwhile, the country outside was unraveling in confusion. Rumors spread fast. Some said the entire cabinet had been murdered. Others that it was a Southern uprising. And to be fair, it almost was. Booth's co-conspirators had tried to kill other government officials that night. Secretary of State Seward had been attacked in his bed, stabbed multiple times, but miraculously survived. The vice president was spared only because his would-be assassin chickened out at the last minute. So while Lincoln was slipping away across the street, Washington was in a state of panic. Soldiers patrolled every corner. People locked their doors. The joy of victory, that electric celebration of peace just hours earlier, had turned into dread. The war was over, but now the president was dying. By dawn, the small bedroom at the Peterson house was crowded. The light from the window began to spill across Lincoln's face, gray and still. Dr. Leal noted that his pulse was nearly gone. Stanton stood silently at the foot of the bed, arms crossed. There was no ceremony, no final speech, no grand farewell. Just slow breathing that faded into nothing. At 7:22 a.m., April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. And then, after a long moment of silence, Edwin Stanton spoke. The words came out low, measured, almost ritualistic. Now he belongs to the ages. It's one of the most famous lines in American history, and maybe one of the truest, because from that moment, Lincoln stopped being a man and became a myth, a story every child would one day learn, a face carved into stone, a name whispered across generations. Afterwards, the room emptied slowly. Mary Todd Lincoln was led in to see him one last time.
She wept over him for several minutes, then fainted. Robert stood silently beside her, holding her hand. No one spoke. Downstairs, soldiers began wrapping Lincoln's body in sheets. Someone placed 2 coins over his eyes. Outside, the crowd stood motionless. When they carried him out, carefully, reverently, the only sound was the creak of boots and the quiet sobs of strangers. The carriage took him back to the White House, where the rooms that once echoed with laughter now filled with mourning drapes and the faint scent of lilies. And Booth? Well, he was already on the run, limping, hiding, burning bridges both literally and metaphorically. But that's a mess we'll float through next time. For now, let's linger here, in this strange in-between, the night when the war truly ended and the man who held the country together finally let go. He'd once said, "Die when I may, I want it said of me that I always plucked a weed and planted a flower wherever I thought a flower would grow." In the dim light of that Washington dawn, you could almost believe he had.
Hey there, welcome back. You've made it through the long night, so let's drift gently into what came next. Not the roar of revenge, not the excitement of a chase, but the slow, tired unraveling of a man who thought himself a hero and ended up a shadow. John Wilkes Booth was not supposed to limp through history like a tragic side character, but that's exactly what happened. The man had planned it all. The perfect timing, the famous line, the daring escape, like it was a scene from one of his plays. He thought the South would rise again in gratitude. He thought he'd be remembered as some kind of modern Brutus. Instead, he ended up cold, filthy, and hiding in the woods with a broken leg and the entire Union Army looking for him. Let's float back to that first night, April 14th, 1865, right after he jumped from the presidential box, snapped his fibula, and still managed to shout Latin while hobbling off stage like a man desperate for applause. Booth stumbled out the back of Ford's Theater and into the alley where his getaway horse was waiting. He actually had a stable hand hold it for him. That poor guy had no idea he was literally holding history's most infamous getaway ride. Booth swung up into the saddle, grimaced in pain, and took off into the Washington night, joined a few minutes later by his accomplice, David Harold, a kind of nervous, loyal sidekick whose main job was be there and panic occasionally. The two galloped south out of the city, crossing the Navy Yard Bridge around midnight. Booth, ever the performer, actually chatted casually with the guard, pretending to be a local heading home late. The guard, oblivious to the chaos back in town, waved him through, which, in fairness, is kind of what happens when your news cycle runs on horseback. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the city was locking down. Stanton, remember him, the ever-efficient Secretary of War, was barking orders like an angry telegraph machine. He ordered roadblocks, sent cavalry patrols in every direction, and offered $100,000 in reward money for Booth's capture. In 1865, that was a life-changing amount. Suddenly, every farmer, soldier, and bounty hunter wanted in. But Booth, despite being injured, knew the countryside well. He and Harold rode hard through the night, eventually arriving at the Maryland home of Dr. Samuel Mudd around 4 a.m. Booth introduced himself under a fake name, though, to be fair, Booth was a bit of a giveaway since his face was on playbills across the country. Dr. Mudd examined the leg, set the bone, and gave him a crutch. The injury was bad. The bone had cracked clean through when Booth's spur caught in the theater bunting. He could barely stand.
Mudd later claimed he didn't know who his patient really was until the next day, which is believable, except for the fact that Booth's face was literally famous and the entire region was buzzing with news about the assassination. Still, Booth rested at the Mudd farm most of that morning before Harold convinced him to move on. They headed deeper into southern Maryland, a flat landscape of farms, swamps, and tobacco fields. Perfect for hiding, terrible for traveling with a broken leg. Booth rode in agony, clutching his crutch across the saddle, stopping occasionally to beg for food and directions. As the days passed, reality began to sink in. He'd expected cheering crowds, maybe secret Confederate sympathizers waiting to hide him. Instead, he got wary stares and closed doors. The war was over. The South was exhausted. No one wanted to die for John Wilkes Booth. And Booth, ever dramatic, began writing in his journal. Because of course he did. His entries read like a man auditioning for martyrdom. He complained that the papers called him a coward, that no one appreciated his sacrifice, and that he'd struck down a tyrant. He even described himself as abandoned with the curse of Cain. It's the kind of writing that sounds deep until you remember he shot an unarmed man in the back of the head. By April 20th, Booth and Harold finally reached the Potomac River. The plan was to cross into Virginia, where they hoped Confederate sympathizers might help them disappear. Except they got lost. Twice. The river's tides were confusing, and Booth wasn't exactly in shape to row. At one point, they spent an entire night circling back to Maryland without realizing it. So much for a clean escape. Meanwhile, the manhunt was closing in. Union cavalry scoured every farm and swamp across Maryland and Virginia. The newspapers published Booth's description daily: tall, dark-haired, handsome, now possibly limping or on crutches. In short, look for the most dramatic man alive who seems to be in pain. Finally, on April 24th, 10 days after the assassination, Booth and Harold stumbled into Virginia, exhausted. They found shelter at a farm owned by Richard Garrett, near Port Royal. The Garretts were simple tobacco farmers. Booth introduced himself as a Confederate soldier returning home, which wasn't unusual in 1865. They took him in. For a couple of nights, Booth rested in their barn. He was pale, feverish, rambling. He bragged about his deed, which again is a strange flex when you're hiding from the entire federal government. The Garretts eventually grew suspicious and locked him in the barn at night, just to be safe. And that's where the cavalry found him. It was April 26th, 12 days after the assassination. A detachment of Union soldiers, led by Lieutenant Edward Doherty, surrounded the farm before dawn. They had orders to capture Booth and Harold, preferably alive, but let's be real, that was wishful thinking. The soldiers demanded surrender. Harold came out quickly, begging for mercy. Booth refused. He shouted through the wooden slats that he'd never be taken alive. Of course he did. The man had been rehearsing this kind of line his entire life. When Booth still wouldn't come out the back door, the soldiers set fire to the barn. The flames lit the night, smoke curling through the cracks. Inside, Booth moved toward the door, his face illuminated in orange light, like some tragic, overacted finale. A soldier named Boston Corbett took aim through a gap in the wall and fired. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, nearly the same spot where he'd shot Lincoln. He fell instantly, paralyzed. They dragged him from the burning barn and laid him on the ground. He lived for about 3 hours. During those last moments, Booth reportedly whispered, "Tell my mother I died for my country." Then, after asking someone to lift his hands so he could see them, he murmured, Useless. Useless. And that was it. The self-styled Avenger, the famous actor turned assassin, died not on a stage, but in the dirt, alone, surrounded by men who despised him. His body was taken back to Washington, photographed, and buried in secret. His family wasn't allowed to claim him for years. His name became a curse in American households, one that erased whatever fame he once enjoyed. In the end, Booth got his wish to be remembered, just not the way he wanted. He thought he'd be celebrated as a hero of the South. Instead, he became the face of treachery, arrogance, and wasted talent. And somewhere in that quiet dawn on April 26th, as the smoke drifted over the Virginia fields, it must have felt like the final act of a terrible play, one where everyone forgot their lines and no one applauded when the curtain fell.
Hey there, welcome back. Go ahead and settle in again, maybe pull the blanket a little higher. This part isn't about chase scenes or gunfire anymore. The noise is over. Now we're stepping into something quieter, heavier. A kind of collective sigh that rolled over an entire country. When Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the United States stopped moving. That's not poetic exaggeration. It literally did. Telegraph lines went silent for a few minutes, as if no one could bring themselves to type the words. Church bells tolled, newspapers printed in black-bordered morning editions, and in the streets, people just stood still. For 4 years, Americans had gotten used to death, too used to it. Every town had lost sons, fathers, brothers to the Civil War. But this one was different. This wasn't another soldier dying on a muddy field. This was the man who had carried the entire weight of that war on his narrow shoulders, who had held the country together with stubborn compassion and quiet exhaustion. And then just as peace arrived, someone had snuffed him out. In Washington, the White House transformed overnight. Black crepe draped across every doorway, mirrors covered, portraits shrouded. The once bustling halls went silent except for the echo of footsteps and the faint sobs of servants who had known him not as a president, but as Mr. Lincoln. Mary Todd stayed upstairs, mostly confined to her room, unable to face the public. She refused to eat for days. Robert Lincoln, the only surviving son, tried to keep things steady, but he was just 21. Imagine that. You're barely an adult, and suddenly your father's body is lying in state in the East Room, and every senator in America is shaking your hands like they expect wisdom from you. Outside the White House, tens of thousands gathered. They lined the streets in silence, some weeping openly, others staring blankly at the building that had become a tomb. Even the weather seemed to participate. Gray skies, a light drizzle, as though the city itself was trying to match the mood. And then came the funeral procession. It began in Washington on April 19th, 4 days after Lincoln's death. They placed him in an elaborate mahogany coffin, lined with lead to preserve the body. The coffin was set inside a grand hearse, draped with black velvet and pulled by 6 white horses. Soldiers marched slowly in front, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. Bands played dirges that blended with the sounds of muffled weeping. The route stretched through Pennsylvania Avenue, the same street Lincoln had once walked for his inauguration, but now lined with black ribbons, bowed heads, and flags flying at half-mast. Every window overflowed with flowers,
and people leaned out holding handkerchiefs or small portraits of him. After the Washington service, the journey west began, what became known as the Lincoln Funeral Train. It's hard to imagine now, but that train was like a moving shrine. It would travel more than 1,600 miles from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, retracing in reverse the exact route Lincoln had taken to Washington 4 years earlier when he became president. It was as if the country wanted to undo the whole story, to send him back home and pretend the nightmare hadn't happened. The train's cars were draped in black cloth, trimmed with silver fringe. Inside, a single car carried 2 coffins, one for Abraham Lincoln and one for his beloved son, Willie, who had died in the White House 3 years earlier from typhoid fever. They would be buried side by side. At every stop, Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York City, Albany, Cleveland, Chicago, people gathered by the thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. They came by wagon, by foot, even wading through mud just to glimpse the train. Church bells tolled, cannons fired salutes, choirs sang "Nearer, My God, to Thee." And the strange thing is, most people didn't actually see the body. They just stood there, often all night, watching the train roll slowly past, covered in bunting and garlands, lit by lanterns that flickered against the dark. They'd remove their hats, bow their heads, and whisper prayers. It wasn't about the man anymore. It was about what he had meant. In Philadelphia, the body was placed in Independence Hall, the same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. More than 100,000 people passed by in a single day. Many fainted from the press of the crowd. Others left flowers, notes, and ribbons. In New York City, the procession was so long it took hours to pass. The black horses, the soldiers, the endless stream of mourners. It was the largest public gathering in the city's history up to that point. There's a quiet irony in all of this. Lincoln, who had lived so modestly, who never wore fine clothes comfortably, now traveled like a monarch in death. A kingly farewell for a man who always looked slightly uncomfortable being important. Meanwhile, the new president, Andrew Johnson, took office in Washington. He promised continuity, unity, and swift justice for the conspirators. And justice came fast. 8 of Booth's accomplices were arrested, tried by military tribunal, and convicted. 4 were hanged that summer, including Mary Surratt, the boarding house owner whose involvement remains debated even now. Booth himself, of course, was already dead, a ghost story in motion. But none of it brought peace. The war had ended, yes, the rebellion crushed, but the nation felt unmoored. Reconstruction began, a word that sounds optimistic but really meant endless argument, corruption, and bitterness. The dream of equality Lincoln had hinted at, a new birth of freedom, was already slipping through the cracks of politics and prejudice. And through all of it, his face started appearing everywhere. Photographs, engravings, newspaper sketches. People clipped his speeches and tucked them into family Bibles. Children memorized his words for school recitations. A generation that had once mocked him as a gangly, awkward, backwoods lawyer now called him Father Abraham. It's easy to forget that Lincoln wasn't always beloved. He was despised by half the country during the war. Newspapers called him an ape, a tyrant, a despot. But death, as it so often does, cleaned up his reputation. Suddenly, he was the gentle savior, the martyr for freedom, the perfect figure to mourn. And maybe that's the thing about history. It smooths over the rough edges. It doesn't show the sleepless nights, the shaking hands, the lonely walks through the White House garden at 2 a.m. It just gives us marble statues and tiny endings. But on that long funeral journey, through the rain, past the weeping crowds, through cities still smelling faintly of gunpowder and grief, there was something raw and human. People weren't mourning a saint. They were mourning someone who had tried and failed and tried again. Someone who had carried a country through hell and still believed in its better angels. On May 4th, 1865, the train finally reached Springfield. The hometown crowd waited in silence. Lincoln's coffin was carried to Oak Ridge Cemetery to a small hill surrounded by trees. The service was simple, no drama, no politics. Just soft words, hymns, and the sound of wind through the grass. And when they lowered him into the ground, next to his son, it was the end of a story that had begun in a one-room cabin and ended with the weight of a nation pressing down. The war was over. The great emancipator was gone. But somewhere between the morning bells and the distant whistle of that train, there was something raw and human. People weren't mourning a saint. They were mourning someone who had tried and failed and tried again. Someone who had carried a country through hell and still believed in its better angels. Even if it would take another 100 years to get close.
Hey again, still awake? No worries if you're half drifting off. This part is meant to be that slow fade between history and myth. We've reached the part of Lincoln's story that doesn't feel like real life anymore. It feels like folklore. The man becomes marble, the face becomes currency, and the memory, well, it becomes convenient. Because as the 1860s ended, America didn't just bury Lincoln, it started building him. In the years right after the funeral, people couldn't stop talking about him. Not the real, awkward, occasionally cranky Lincoln, but a carefully polished version. Newspapers printed glowing tributes. Ministers compared him to Moses. Sculptors started chipping away at blocks of marble, turning a weary, hollow-eyed man into something eternal and wise-looking. It's a strange process, myth-making. One day, you're arguing with your cabinet about tariffs. The next, you're basically America's saint. And Lincoln's transformation happened faster than most. His assassination helped, of course, and I know how that sounds. But martyrdom has a powerful PR department. Dying just after ending a war, with your final public words calling for malice toward none, was the kind of poetic timing that made 19th century writers absolutely lose their minds. Within a year, people were calling him the savior of the Union. There were songs written about him, like Abraham Lincoln's funeral hymn, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly a banger, but people cried to it anyway. By 1867, plans were underway to build the Lincoln Tomb in Springfield. A massive monument of granite and bronze, complete with a 117-foot obelisk, because apparently the Victorians couldn't do anything subtle. The tomb became a pilgrimage site. People came from across the country to see where the man who freed the slaves was buried, and maybe to feel a little better about the national mess they were still living in. But here's the thing, while the myth was growing, the reality of what Lincoln had fought for was slipping through people's fingers. Reconstruction was collapsing into chaos. The promise of equality was met with violence, discrimination, and the slow rise of Jim Crow laws. Freedmen's schools were burned, black voters were intimidated or killed, and through it all, politicians kept invoking Lincoln's name, as if saying, what would Abe do could cover up the fact that they weren't doing much of anything. So the legend of Lincoln became a kind of comfort story, a bedtime tale for a nation that didn't want to face its reflection. Writers like Josiah Holland and William Herndon, Lincoln's old law partner, started publishing biographies. Some were reverent, others messy and honest. Herndon, for instance, didn't sugarcoat anything. He wrote about Lincoln's depression, his doubts about religion, his strained marriage. It scandalized readers who wanted a saint, not a sad poet president. Meanwhile, others doubled down on the divinity. They wrote that Lincoln was chosen by God, born under some shining star, destined to end slavery. You know, the kind of stuff that sells well in Sunday school pamphlets. The 1880s and 90s turned Lincoln into a cultural phenomenon. His face showed up on posters, calendars, pocket watches, and even cigar boxes. Schools were named after him. Children memorized the Gettysburg Address the way kids now memorize TikTok dances. And then in 1909, his 100th birthday, the U.S. Treasury rolled out the Lincoln penny, the first American coin to feature a real person. It's like the government finally said, okay, fine, he's permanent now. The design was by Victor David Brenner, who modeled it after a photograph of Lincoln by Matthew Brady, one of those solemn, slightly weary portraits where he looks both tired and timeless. That's the face that would outlast everything. By then, the Lincoln myth had gone global. European writers saw him as the noble peasant who rose from poverty. Russians compared him to their ideal of the wise peasant king. Even in Japan, educators used Lincoln as a symbol of humble virtue. It's funny, he'd probably hate that. He never thought of himself as humble or noble. He thought of himself as someone who got lucky, who read too many books by candlelight, and who tried his best not to make things worse. But history has a way of editing out the self-doubt. Let's float over now to the 1920s, a decade obsessed with heroes and monuments. Washington, D.C. decided that Lincoln deserved something grander than a tomb in Illinois, something imperial. Enter the Lincoln Memorial. Construction began in 1914 and took 8 years, delayed by war, politics, and the general American tendency to argue over who gets to approve the design. When it finally opened in 1922, it was everything Lincoln had never been. Enormous, ornate, and solemn. A Greek temple of white marble filled with silence. 36 columns for the 36 states in the Union when he died. And inside, a giant seated statue of Lincoln, carved from 28 blocks of Georgia marble. He sits there, calm and slightly melancholy, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, like someone who's just finished a long argument with history and is too tired to stand. Robert Lincoln, old and gray by then, attended the dedication. He didn't speak. He just watched, quietly, as his father became a literal monument. And over time, that memorial took on a second life. In 1939, Marian Anderson sang there after being barred from another concert hall because of her race. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on those same steps to deliver his "I Have a Dream" speech. It's almost poetic that Lincoln, the man who couldn't live to see equality realized, ended up being the silent witness to its most famous moment. But for all the marble and myth, there's something stubbornly human that keeps peeking through. The letters he wrote to grieving mothers, the way he carried candy in his pockets for children, his awkward jokes, his love of theater, and his tendency to get lost in melancholy. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't always kind. He could be stubborn, sarcastic, and occasionally wrong. But somehow that makes him more comforting. Because it means greatness can come from imperfection. even from someone who once lost 8 elections and had a voice like a squeaky hinge. When people visit his memorial now, they still whisper. There's something about that place, the echo of footsteps, the cool air, the way the light falls across the statue's face that makes you instinctively lower your voice. It's less like visiting a hero and more like sitting quietly in front of a memory. The legend of Lincoln is still growing even now. Every decade, new writers try to reinterpret him as a philosopher, a pragmatist, a melancholic idealist. Maybe he's all of those things, or maybe none. Maybe he's just the most complicated bedtime story America ever told itself. And as the centuries stretch on, his words still surface, not shouted, but whispered, steady as breathing, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Simple, tired words from a man who wanted peace more than glory. And maybe that's why, even 160 years later, we still can't quite let him go.
Hey, you're still here. Impressive. Most people would have drifted off by now, probably somewhere around the funeral train part. But you're committed. So, let's stay in that quiet space a little longer. Tonight's final stretch is about what happens after a person becomes history, when the echoes get softer and all that's left is the strange, lingering hum of legacy. Lincoln's story didn't end in 1865, or even at the dedication of that massive marble temple. It never really ended at all. It just kept rippling outward, through decades of speeches, textbooks, arguments, and half-remembered quotes about freedom and unity. And here's the funny part. Everyone thinks they know Lincoln, but everyone knows a different one. To some, he's the great emancipator, the man who freed the slaves and saved the Union. To others, he's the constitutional manipulator who suspended habeas corpus and expanded presidential power like it was a new hobby. To still others, he is a tragic poet king, too gentle for the brutality of his own century. The truth, as always, is somewhere muddled in between, which, honestly, is exactly how he'd want it. After his death, Lincoln's words became tools. Politicians used them like holy scripture. In the late 19th century, Republicans claimed his mantle for progress and unity. By the mid-20th, Democrats invoked him for civil rights and social justice. Even now, everyone from small-town mayors to global leaders will quote him at some point, usually while staring at a teleprompter with deep, pretend sincerity. Because Lincoln isn't just a person anymore. He's shorthand for moral authority, for doing the right thing, whatever that happens to mean this election cycle. But beyond the speeches and the monuments, there's a quieter story, a strange afterlife that's as weirdly American as Lincoln himself. Let's float a bit, not forward, not back, just sideways, into some of the odd ripples of his legacy. In 1876, for instance, 11 years after his death, a group of counterfeiters tried to steal Lincoln's body. Yes, really. They wanted to hold it for ransom and demand the release of one of their imprisoned gang members. It did not go well. The Secret Service, newly formed, ironically, to stop counterfeiting, caught wind of the plan and stopped them mid-heist. After that, Lincoln's body was moved, secretly reburied in a steel cage beneath tons of concrete, because apparently, even in death, he couldn't catch a break. Then, there's the Lincoln assassination's weird habit of haunting pop culture. Plays, movies, novels, the story gets told and retold, each generation adding a little more melancholy or melodrama. In the 20th century, he became a symbol of lost virtue, that nostalgic idea that America used to have better men.
It's comforting, in a sad way, to imagine a time when leaders read Shakespeare by lamplight instead of arguing on cable news. But it's also a little dishonest. Lincoln's America was chaotic, divided, and full of people who hated each other passionately. Well, you get the point. Even in the arts, Lincoln lingers. Carl Sandburg wrote a 6-volume biography in the 1920s that painted him as both myth and man, the prairie lawyer who somehow carried the spirit of the people. It won a Pulitzer, of course, because Americans love a story that feels like gospel, especially if it involves a log cabin. And then there are the ghost stories. Oh yes, the Lincoln White House ghost lore. Mary Todd Lincoln, deep in grief after her husband's death, attended seances. She truly believed she could speak to him. And over the decades, others have said they felt his presence in the White House. Winston Churchill, of all people, claimed he once walked into the Lincoln bedroom after a bath, completely naked, saw the ghost of Lincoln standing by the fireplace and simply said, "Good evening, Mr. President," then calmly walked out. You can't make that up. Well, someone probably did, but it's delightful anyway. The legend stretches even further, to Hollywood. From Henry Fonda's Noble Lincoln and Young Mr. Lincoln to Daniel Day-Lewis's soft-spoken philosopher in Lincoln 2012, each version reflects what people need from him at that moment. During the Depression, he was the self-made man who never gave up. During the Civil Rights era, he was the moral compass. In our own time, he's the weary leader who tries to hold chaos together with decency. It's as if every generation remakes him in its own anxious image. And maybe that's why he lasts. He's adaptable, elastic, symbolic enough to fit in every political speech, but real enough to feel like a person, someone who struggled, doubted, and made compromises. Let's be honest, Lincoln was never a saint. He wrestled with bigotry, power, grief, and depression. He was a man of his time, not beyond it. But the myth of him, that's what we hold on to when things feel unfixable. The myth says one person can make things better, even if only a little. Maybe that's why in schools and museums and quiet corners of old courthouses, his image still feels strangely alive. His top hat, his long fingers, the worn black coat, all relics that remind us of something gentler in the human story. Even in literature, Lincoln has become a stand-in for moral gravity. Writers invoke him when they need to remind us that empathy and intellect can share the same body, that kindness isn't weakness, that humor can live beside sorrow. And then there's that voice. People who heard him speak said it was high-pitched, almost nasal, not the deep, booming baritone we imagine from movie trailers. But maybe that's fitting. History tends to deepen our voices when it wants us to sound more important. The real Lincoln's voice, like the real man, was unassuming. It's been more than 150 years since that night at Ford's Theater. The play, the shot, the candlelight vigil, all of it's frozen now in sepia. But every April 14th, people still gather there. They sit in those creaky wooden seats, watch the performance of Our American Cousin, and at the exact time the shot rang out, they observe a moment of silence. It's eerie, sure, but also kind of beautiful. Because history, at its best, is a form of remembering, not glorifying, not sanitizing, just remembering. In that silence, Lincoln becomes less of a myth and more of a whisper, the quiet presence of someone who once believed the world could be a little better if people just listened to their better angels. And that whisper carries, even now. It's in the echoes of speeches about unity, in the awkward jokes of politicians trying too hard, in the sighs of teachers explaining the Civil War to half-asleep students. It's in the quiet rustle of leaves around his tomb in Springfield, and in the marble chill of his seated figure watching over Washington. History doesn't really end. It just fades, softly, until someone new picks up the thread. So maybe that's how we leave him tonight. Not as the myth, not even as the martyr, just the man who, through all the noise and heartbreak, tried to steer a divided world towards something gentler. And maybe, as we finally close our eyes and let the story settle, we can imagine him there, in that endless stillness, smiling just a little, under the soft flicker of theater lights that never really go dark. Good night, Mr. Lincoln. Good night, everyone.